Movie music websites at FeedSpot. Chapter 1. Movie music websites for music creators and fans. Film music blogs at bloggers.feedspot.com/film_music_blogs. bearmccreary.com/bears-blog. filmmusiccentral.com. filmmusicnotes.com/blog. filmmusicreporter.com. filmstro.com/blog. jwfan.com. moviemusicuk.us/category/news. scoringzscience.com. sidiontrackcone.com. soundtrack.net. soundtrackheaven.blogspot.com. soundtrackscoresandmore.com. Film music magazines at magazine.feedspot.com/film_music_magazines. filmmusicreporter.com. composer.spitfireaudio.com/category/film-in-tv. standard.co.uk/topic/film-music. Film music podcasts at podcast.feedspot.com/film_music_podcasts. composerspod.com. edhartmanmusic.com/podcasts. filmscorejunkie.blogspot.com. measuringthescore.podbean.com. pod.co/chapters. podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/score. podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/Christopher-Rice56. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/music-film-saves-the-world-film-id15855485223. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/film-score-junkie/id15903290667. podcasts.apple.com/us/the-silent-film-music-model/id 534447043. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/the-film-scorers/id 15335974773. podcasts.apple.com/us/ed-hartmans-wild-world-of-music-of-and-film/id 155397392. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/measuring-the-score/id 15536401009. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/score-the-podcast/id 13578827884. podcasts.apple.com/ca/composers-the-movie-score-podcast/id 14604947444. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/settling-the-score/id 12938555553. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/what's-the-score-podcast/id 14603106663. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/chapters/id 16357455968. settlingthescorepodcast.com. thefilmscorer.podbean.com. whatsthescore1.podbean.com. YouTube Film Score Channels. youtube.com/user/edhartman1. youtube.com/@composerspodcast7107. youtube.com/@thefilmscorer. youtube.com/@atala-ia-music. youtube.com/@apclefmedia. Soundtrack podcasts at podcast.feedspot.com/soundtrack_podcasts. alternative-80s.captivate.fm. audioboom.com/channels/4794784-soundtracking-with-edith-bowman. barsilence.com. batlebards.libcn.com. cms.megaphone.fm/channel/hsw21934733754. digitikey.com/podcast.html. djtravesty.podbean.com. feeds.buzzsprout.com/1947796. feeds.buzzsprout.com/1840875. howimakemusic.com/episode. jasoncharles.net/podcasts/music_shows. mixcloud.com/beachhousemusic. podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/jspot. podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/sidetrack-twit-hon-dj. podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/composer-talk. podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/conversation-with-Ben. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/conversation-with-ben/id 16801145005. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/soundtrack-your-life/id 15243208003. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/dj-travesty-podcast/id 15148177745. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/for-music-the-soundtrack-podcast/id 16170479775. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/bar-silence-video-game-music-podcast/id 16055083001. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/soundtracking-with-edith-bowman/id 1140497332. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/the-contemplative-podcast/id 14878153338. podcasts.apple.com/au/podcast/strictly-soundtracks/id 15041939666. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/the-quiet-village-podcast/id 590542998. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/the-morricone-island-devon-e-levens-wfmu/id 15541943882. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/the-soundtrack-show/id 13519606656. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/the-je-spot/id 15591682775. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/soundtrack-soul/id 15153152889. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/how-i-make-music/id 14607936686. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/soundtracker/id 15826436161. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/the-real-sonic-chronic/id 16708187885. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/composer-talk/id 15083858823. podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/the-soul-shack-w-dj-j-me/id 306968245. podomatic.com/podcasts/soulshack. soundtrackyourlife.net/episodes. terraplayer.com/shows/longplay. thecontemplativepodcast.podbean.com. thesonicchronic.podbean.com. weekendworkout.libzn.com/podcast. wfmu.org/playlists/pw. YouTube soundtrack channels. youtube.com/@4formusic51. youtube.com/@barcelenscevgm, youtube.com/@felixgartal, youtube.com/c/beachhousepodcast, youtube.com/user/joy9490, youtube.com/@wfmu, youtube.com/g33klifetv, youtube.com/@conversationwithben.